Southern Fried Asian. I'm your host, Keith Chow. On the podcast, this is a very special month, January 2021. We have a new administration. It's a new day, it's a new dawn, and I'm feeling good. And I'm feeling good particularly because we have a native Georgian. Is it Atlantean or is it like ATLian?
Yeah, ATLian, that's right.
Joining us on the podcast because Georgia turned blue in 2020, and it turned blue because of people of color and particularly Asian Americans. Please welcome to the podcast someone partly responsible for that blue wave in Georgia. She is a videographer, she's a spoken word artist, she's a storyteller. Please welcome to the podcast, Kavi Vu.
Woo! Thank you. Yes, you're welcome for saving democracy. Heavy burden.
Well, talk about that. So, I wanted to have someone from Georgia on the podcast because, January 5th was an historic day. Jon Ossoff, Raphael Warnock became senators from Georgia, two Democratic senators from Georgia, a black man and a Jewish man. And again, fueled by the people of color in Georgia.
Mm-hmm.
And let's not forget, Georgia turned blue in November as well, voted for Joe Biden and Kamala Harris. So talk about the work that you did and how did you help turn Georgia blue this year? Specifically, all the work you did.
Yes, all the things that I did to make Georgia blue. Let's see. Yeah, it feels like centuries ago, even though it's been like 2 weeks. I guess at the beginning of it, I think folks are like, wow, like overnight Georgia turned blue, but it's been like a decade and much more of organizing. But at the end of the 2016 elections, I was like, I guess like everybody else was like, how could this happen? And at the time I was very apolitical, as a lot of sleepy Asian Americans in Georgia, I think, were. And a lawyer friend of mine said, and at the time I was like planning on going to LA, planning on jump-starting my BuzzFeed video career. And she's like, are you really going to leave at this time? Like, are you going to leave Georgia at this time? And I was just so disappointed, by the outcome of the election that I'm like, hell yeah, I'm going to leave. I'm going to go somewhere blue. I think it's a lot of people, when they think about Georgia turning blue, it feels like it was like, just a couple months or like one day that happened. But a lot of my organizer friends and I know that it's been, this past 5 years of hard relational organizing, and even beyond that, like the past 10, 15, 20 years of work of like finding Asian Americans in Georgia in the crevices where they live and saying, hey, we know you're here and we are going to translate all the things for you in every language that you need for you to feel like this is your democracy and that your vote counts here. And when I started doing this work 5 years ago, wow, doesn't feel like it. Sometimes it feels like it's 20 years ago and sometimes it feels like yesterday. But
Trump years are like dog years for sure.
Yeah, for real. But when we started doing this work, there was an interesting question when we got our grant, which was like, is it worth it? Is it worth it to do specific, in language work? How many Asian Americans are there really in Georgia? And can it become a margin of victory to target Asian Americans? And we couldn't tell you. We knew that all the data, all the census data wasn't correct. Asian Americans are always undercounted. So we're like, even if we, give you this information, it's not really going to help that much using the census data. So we're like, we're gonna fix that. And so we worked heavily on 2020 census to make sure that we were going to get an accurate count. And that's really important. And so these past 5 years that we've been working, we're just working on making sure that Asian Americans, and especially Asian American young people, understand that it's not just an every 4-year thing, but it's like every local election, every town hall, every community meeting, that if more Asian Americans were present, then more politicians are going to care about what we need for our communities. And we talked about the Asian apathy circle on our talk show, Wake Up Atlanta, a lot, because we're like, how come all the Asian Americans that we surveyed in Atlanta and in Georgia, like none of them received any kind of civic engagement from politicians. Because like I was doing civic engagement outreach and I realized that I wasn't receiving any of it in the mail. And that's because no politicians in Georgia cared about the Asian American vote. And we're like, why is that? And then we're like, oh, yeah, that's because Asian Americans don't vote. But like,
Right.
if politicians don't reach out to us, then that's why we don't vote. It's like chicken or the egg.
And, I mean, to be fair, most politicians, especially those on the right side of the aisle, don't want people to vote. Like, I mean, that's clear. That's been clear the last few months.
That's a whole new conversation. Yeah. And so what I was like learning back then was like, man, like we don't ask Asian Americans to vote. And so for like 4 years straight, we're like, all we have to do is like tell them to vote or register them to vote. And then like in my first 2 years, like working the polls and being a poll monitor to help folks interpret, I realized that it is so hard to vote. Like voting in Georgia is like a full-time job. It is not something that you just like take an hour to do or take 30 minutes out of your day to do. It's like it's just,
I mean, you're in line for
steps.
8 hours at best, right? I mean, it's so funny that like the last couple weeks, Roethlisberger and Brian Kemp are almost kind of like lauded as these heroes of democracy because they stood up to Trump. But it's like, those motherfuckers are the reason people can't vote in Georgia as it is.
I know. And then like when you look at like the lines alone, yeah, you've seen the headlines, the 4 hours, the 6 hours of waiting in line that Georgians have to go through. And before that, they already like it's like work before you show up to work. Like
right.
In 2018, like hundreds of thousands of voter registrations were thrown out because of an exact match law, which was like absurd because so in Georgia, they were like, okay, if your voter registration name doesn't exactly like to the T, like every space, every hyphen match what they had in their database, which was at the time Department of Motor Vehicles, so like your driver's license. But the thing was that like just like a regular person, and most likely a white lady, let's be real, is like entering the stuff in manually. So like Karen is not gonna know how to spell Nguyen, and she's gonna like look at it and be like, I don't know, Nugen, and like, and we as people of color who have complicated names just know that it takes more than one glance at a paperwork to like, into typing it in. We double check, we triple check. I quadruple check when I'm spelling my own name, and I know Karen's not doing that. So if it doesn't look like John Smith, she's probably gonna spell it wrong. And so that's why that law just like disproportionately affected Black, Latinx, and Asian American communities. And it's just like, it's surgical and just so like evil genius kind of way that it's like, wow, you wrote a law that's beautiful.
Like, I mean, it's intentional, right? Like that. They
smart.
feign that it's just a coincidence, or like they make up the whole idea that there's voter fraud is in and of itself a myth that's propagated solely to disenfranchise people of color. Like that's the only reason. It's not a coincidence that whenever voter fraud actually is apparent or found or proven, it's usually like Republicans doing it. Like,
yeah.
That's just an irony,
Oh my gosh. After we had the 3 recounts and like they act like Georgians are just going to hold our breath for every recount. And I'm like, dude, I'd be dead by now. Like, I think we won. But yeah, like after we had the recount, so one of our friends in the first Vietnamese American representative in Georgia, she actually called out the data analyst that Trump was basically like obsessing over because he like listed a list of voter fraud in Georgia and like released all their names and addresses of folks. And so Bee Nguyen, our Vietnamese rep, actually like checked all these names. And she's like, hey, in these instances, that is not voter fraud. It's just a voter who was confused as to like how the law works. And it was like a wife signing for her husband. That's not voter fraud. Like, that's just like they kind of messed up, So when you looked into these certain instances of voter fraud, it was just complete BS. So, and then there was another case that she pointed out where the voter didn't sign where the line was. He signed like under the line. That's not voter fraud. That's just a confused voter. So all the times when folks say voter fraud, I'm just like, ah. And after Bee did that, she made national headlines, and then she actually got threats to her house. And so Georgia police had to kind of make sure that she was okay. And that's awful that, just for someone calling out the truth that they're threatened like this. So it's been crazy in Georgia, but it feels like a Tuesday now because it's always crazy.
I actually want to talk about Bee a little bit because I know that you've done some work for her campaign. I think you shot one of her campaign videos when she was running for the state house. She actually serves in the same seat that Stacey Abrams used to sit in. So that's awesome. And you have a connection to the family too, because I think you and her sister had an organization, I think you called it a show. Was it like a internet show or something?
Yeah. So now I know the whole Nguyen family. But I first met Fee, Bee's sister, and Fee was the one who kind of started this whole civic engagement journey for me. She reached out on Facebook and asked if I wanted to help her register some Vietnamese voters. And I was like, I guess, yeah, like voter registration is nice. I don't even think at the time I was registered to vote myself.
I was going to ask, like, were you politically active at the time?
No, not at all. And I think in a lot of Asian American families, but specifically Vietnamese, we just didn't talk about it, politics and government, and it was just not something that my parents were ever comfortable talking about. Just being such recent immigrants and refugees from Vietnam, they were like, no, like we're lucky enough to be here. Just keep your head down, hush.
Right.
And my mom had a couple run-ins with like discrimination by the police in South Georgia. And so she was like really just afraid of all things. Yeah. And so it was just not like a comfortable space for them. So, and Fee's family was very similar. And she's like, but it's time, we know the law. Like Fee is a lawyer and I studied journalism law. And so I was like, I guess I feel kind of comfortable. And I did a lot of things for the Vietnamese community growing up. So I had like a pretty big Vietnamese and Asian American network. So I started registering voters with her. And then we realized though that voter registration without voter education does not work. Because you're really just skewing the numbers because you're getting all these folks to register to vote and then you just disappear and don't help them when it actually comes time to vote. And as you know, it's not just every 4 years thing. So we created a web show called Wake Up Atlanta, where we just broke down some of these things. While we were registering folks to vote, we had all kinds of questions. I mean, like, can you vote for Trump and Hillary? And we were like, first of all, why would you want to? Second of all, no, you can't do that. And I mean, questions like, do I have to re-register to vote every time there's an election? And we're like, well, like if you're in everywhere else, no, but in Georgia, you might have to.
Right.
And the irony there. They'd be like, what's a senator? And I'm like, hold
no.
up. So like it was interesting because Wake Up Atlanta was an educational talk show, but I mean, I was being educated the whole time
right
too. So it was like viewers were kind of seeing my journey into being more civically engaged. So we interviewed a lot of elected officials. We would just go into like boba shops and ask folks, what do you know? What do you not know? What do you want to know? So that was really fun. And through that, I got a lot more connected with the Asian American community here and just learned like what was missing. And I think the biggest thing missing is in language support. And that's how I think we were able to successfully flip and to engage so many Asian American voters because of that.
The other thing about Georgia, or just, the South in general, is that if you're not from the South, especially Asian Americans who are primarily congregated in like the West Coast or maybe like the
Hmm.
Northeast, there's a perception that like one, I mean, it's the reason we do this podcast. Are there even Asians in the South? And two, like, you know, there can't be enough to make a difference, right? And in terms of
Hmm.
like electoral politics. But I think to your point about like being the margin of difference in a state as close as Georgia, activating the Asian American community is vital to electoral victory, right? And the fact that like Georgia is not actually a, you know, there are a lot of Asians in Georgia, right? Like there's a very thriving Vietnamese community, there's a thriving Korean
Oh
community,
yeah,
South
we have
Asian.
almost 500,000.
Right, exactly. So like Georgia and Atlanta in particular, the metro Atlanta is an Asian American like enclave, right?
It's a hub. Yeah, yeah. Like folks from all around come here to like grocery shop. We're seeing like folks from Florida come up here just to like eat Korean barbecue, you know, and like folks from Tennessee, South Carolina, yeah, Alabama. They're coming here because they realize that the AAPI communities here are growing and thriving.
What has it been like for, I mean, I'm sure you've engaged with a lot of folks. I know you'd mentioned earlier, I think before we started recording, that like you talk to people from California or New York and they're surprised that you're like,
That we exist.
well, that did you exist, one, and you, and two, like Atlanta itself is pretty high tech for you from where
Yeah.
you grew up. But like, you know, the idea of being Asian American Southerner, like how do you define yourself in that regard?
Mm, I it's interesting. Like I think that this is fate a little bit because I am from the South. So I think when a lot of folks think, or nationally, when people think of Atlanta, they're like, yeah, that's like, wow, Atlanta is like the South. But when you're actually here, Atlanta is this nice like blue bubble
Right.
that is super diverse and it's super progressive. And so a lot of Asian Americans who grew up here in Atlanta know of that diversity. But when you have folks like me who came from way south of Atlanta, we're talking like Confederate flags,
Hmm.
still very proudly flying.
Yeah. There's a country band named after like where you lived, right? Like Florida Georgia Line,
Florida
isn't
Georgia.
it?
Yes, yeah, exactly. And I mean, I remember being, like one of the only Asian American or Vietnamese families in my town,
Hmm.
and I wanted one of those flags, like I
Right.
wanted that merch because I wanted to fit in, and I
Exactly.
was very confused when I first got to Atlanta. I was like, what who are all these people? And like, why are there so many Asians? Yeah, because that's all I knew. I grew up on a very small farm town, and it's been incredible to come to Atlanta and see the diversity
Hmm.
and like see the big town. So
But I think
yeah, like
that's another misconception that I think as Asian Americans we actually need to actively work against, and it's this idea that like there is no such thing as conservative Asians. But I think it's
whew,
specifically in the Vietnamese community. I know a lot of like recent Chinese immigrants, like they are super, they can be, let's say, super conservative. How do you fight back against like the just kind of natural conservatism in a lot of like Asian immigrant families?
ah, ugh.
Touched a nerve, it sounds like.
Yeah, especially when I'm seeing a flag, the South Vietnamese flag, a flag that I've fought for and my parents have fought for all our lives. To see that flag at the Capitol insurrection
Mhm.
was just heartbreaking. And a lot of my friends have like the Vietnamese flag tattooed on themselves,
Right.
like the yellow with the three red stripes. And I've signed so many petitions because a lot of different colleges, would fly, a bunch of flags, but they would always fly the what is now the communist flag of
Mhm.
Vietnam. And we would always have to fight, hey, you have to fly both flags because that's the reality for us. That's not our flag for Vietnamese Americans.
Right.
And to be fighting for 10 years straight for our pride in that flag, and then to see it next to a Trump flag at the Capitol, oh gosh, it's
Yeah,
heartbreaking.
I can imagine.
Yeah, and doing all the work that we do for Vietnamese communities here in Georgia, and then to see that it's almost like they don't want that help, and that work is disheartening.
I think to what you said earlier about like a lot of it is about education too, and I think the Republicans have kind of been successful. I mean, one of the surprising things about November is that Trump actually gained voters. Not only did he gain like 16 more million than in 2016, but he gained in like certain Black communities, he gained in Latinx communities,
Mm-hmm.
and particularly around like like Cuban Americans and Vietnamese
Mm-hmm.
Americans, playing on their like anti-communist,
Yeah.
anti-socialism
Yeah, and
beliefs.
he's tough on China. That's what they love. And my dad is also super Trumpy.
Mhm.
And a lot of Vietnamese Americans think that Biden was against Vietnamese refugees. And
Mhm.
that is such a smart talking point,
Mhm.
because like that's not true. But like, I don't know how they got it to spread the way that it did. But like, I can't meet one Vietnamese parent who doesn't think that. And I'm
I
like,
mean, I'll
man,
tell you how. It's called Facebook. That's how. That's how that
freaking
spreads.
genius, you know what I mean? But I actually just got Facebook jailed the other day because a group of Vietnamese young folks and I created a show that was attempting to fight disinformation in Vietnamese communities. And so those of us who are lucky enough to like know our parents' language, we basically created like a daily show, but in Vietnamese, just kind of like combating all this fake news that our parents were just, gosh, like religiously listening to. And we talked about Black Lives Matter, we talked about voter suppression, and like we released like 5 episodes. And within, it's been like 2-3 months maybe, and literally like 2 days ago, our whole page got shut down on Facebook,
Mhm.
and everyone who was an admin, so like 15 of us, got our Facebooks disabled.
I wonder if I mean that I've been reading of like crackdowns on a lot of like leftist pages and any kind of
Mm-hmm.
like. I wonder if just I mean, Facebook is fucking evil, regardless. Like, and I just wonder if it's like it's Zuckerberg's way of like, well, I'm because I banned Trump, I guess I now have to ban actual, like the whole
Yeah.
both sidesism where they equate like actual disinformation and lies with people trying to tell the truth, but you have to somehow seem quote unquote objective. I don't know, it's stupid.
Yeah. Oh, I mean, I'm sure it must be so difficult, and just from like journalism school and creating Wake Up Atlanta, trying to make sure that both sides have a voice and we're addressing like everybody's concerns. I'm sure it must be so difficult, but like I think that our page got reported by like a big angry group of Vietnamese oldies, and I was like, man, that was quick. Like they got us shut down in like an hour.
Yeah.
So, but it is like, it makes me a little proud knowing that we were doing something right,
Right.
or else they wouldn't have gone through all that effort.
Yeah, I mean, they hate you for a reason, so at least
Yeah.
that's a good thing.
Yeah. Haters gonna hate.
So I guess you said it was because Fee reached out to you, that's how you became politically active. Like, do you feel like if not for that random Facebook message, would you have still eventually gone the direction you
Mm,
went?
I think so. I think a part of me is like a mover and like a doer. So I think eventually I would have gone here in this space anyway, in like advocacy. But it was just great that Fee like reached out so long ago and said, hey, like I know that no one's paying attention to Asian Americans, but we can change that.
Mm-hmm.
And with your voice and your skills and video, I was like, I guess, but literally like nobody is talking about Asian Americans. You know that, right? Like literally zero people. And it's just so cool to see now, like, this recent election for our runoff, like Californians and New Yorkers and Texas, they're just like all eyes on Georgia and Asian Americans in Georgia. I was like, oh my gosh,
Right.
see, you were fucking right. Like, if we keep doing this for like 5 years straight, they're gonna talk about us. Like they know we exist.
I mean, that's a great point because like you said, this wasn't, people think just because, the runoffs November to January, that's the only time people paid attention. But the work on the ground, Fair Fight, Stacey Abrams, Latasha Brown, like all of these people putting in the work, Asian Americans Advancing Justice, like
Yep.
all of these people putting in the work on the ground for at least 5 years, probably longer, right? Like
Way
Stacey Abrams
longer,
has been
yeah.
doing the work for a
Oh,
decade.
yeah.
It's not that she just popped on the scene in 2018, you know?
Right, right. And yeah, and now it's like this trendy thing to like, phone bank and text bank. And I'm like, dang, where were y'all? Like, where were y'all in 2016? Damn it.
Well, but that's the thing I wanted to ask too about Georgia, because Georgia, for the first time since Jimmy Carter swung blue in the presidential, now has 2 senators.
Yup.
Is Georgia going to be more like North Carolina, where it kind of just swings back and forth? Is it a purple state, or is it literally like where I'm from, Virginia, where it becomes a blue state and it will be solidly a blue state from here on out? What do you foresee?
Ooh. So Stacey Abrams said this a lot, and I wholeheartedly believe this, that Georgia is not a red state, it is a voter suppressed state.
Mm-hmm.
And to like, man, in 2018, when I was working the polls and seeing how difficult it was for folks to vote, I was like, we can't do this. Like, we can't just keep telling people that, oh, it just takes 5 minutes in and out.
Mm-hmm.
We got to change like the system. And so, like, Asian Americans Advancing Justice, they've been doing such great work in Fair Fight in like challenging the really crazy laws and the barriers that we put Georgia voters through. And so I think that we're finally getting a chance to write laws that benefit our voters. And like, we're not just like spending all our time fighting the laws
Mm-hmm.
that suppress our voters. And so my hope in these next few steps that we take are that will make it easier for folks to vote, therefore keeping our blue hold. But they're going to be pissed. Like,
Oh, yeah.
they're very mad now. So we're going to see a lot more attempts at voter suppression.
But I think the point you made earlier is vital in this the sense that, like, for a long time, and I think this is definitely more the case for liberals than conservatives, we tend to only vote in presidentials, right? Like, it's the reason why Obama won overwhelmingly twice, but then couldn't govern because no one showed up in the midterms, right? Like,
Right.
we just think like we just vote for a president and then the president will solve everything, and then not realizing
Mm-hmm.
you have to vote for Congress every 2 years. You have to vote in your local elections so that like state houses and state senates are the ones who
Right.
are drawing these gerrymandered districts to begin with. Like,
Right.
you have to
Mm-hmm.
vote your mayor, your city council, your school board. Like,
Mm-hmm.
liberals and progressives need to be in this constantly, if we
Yeah.
have any hope to like overcome. Because the other thing I wanted to ask about is this idea of the South. A lot of times I think, liberal politics, progressive politics kind of writes off the South. We just
Mm-hmm.
look at the map and like, okay, these states are always going to be red. We'll just concentrate on these blue states over here. And like, states like, like Mississippi, like Alabama, like Georgia before 2 years ago,
Mm-hmm.
these were states that are, as Stacey Abrams says, states that are not red states, not blue states. They are voter suppressed states. And
Yeah.
if we just constantly let, white conservative politicians run everything, there's no way we can ever overcome the suppression to put liberal and progressive politicians in office. So talk about that. Like, how can we spread what happened in Georgia to other parts of the South? Because, as you said, like, there are parts of the South that are, yes, definitely very rural, very white, very Confederate.
Mm-hmm.
But there are also
Mm-hmm.
large populations of Black communities, Latinx communities, Asian communities all throughout the South who can form a coalition and
Yeah.
have electoral power.
Yeah. Yeah. I think it's in the money that we spend on civic engagement efforts, on community efforts. I think that what we did right is that we have been here for the community. And we're not just swooping in during an election year and saying, hey, you should vote. But like, we were there when they have COVID problems, and they can't pay for their groceries. Asian American Advancing Justice is there giving these folks like literal groceries every Sunday and Monday. We're there when they need to fight their visa or fill out their visas, and just making sure that we aren't just interested in the politics, but really like interested in the well-being of our communities,
Mm-hmm.
I think that that is where we can win. And that's where we can gain the trust of our people and build like a thriving community and like an engaged community. And then when we're like, hey, you can trust me. I've literally like been here for you, you know?
Right.
That's when our communities listen. And when we listen to them too, and when they say like we want more coffee shops that have art, we're like, okay, let's find some Asian Americans and give artists and give them some money and put up some art. I think it just takes effort a little bit to do
Mm.
that. And Atlanta did have a good amount of funding. Like Wake Up Atlanta was born from Atlanta really like seeing the value in like relational organizing and just the importance of like three really activated people.
Well, and I think the other thing, you know, like I said, you consider yourself a storyteller, and narrative and messaging is such an important aspect. Like, I think that's another thing where conservatives often outdo progressives in like getting their message out there. Like you said, how does a fucking lie spread so easily among the voting base of Trump, right? Like, I mean, it helps that like they believe fiction, maybe, but I think, but that's also, there's also some sort of like storytelling tropes that the right somehow is able to activate to get people to believe their stories, right? Like how can, I guess the question is, how can people on the left, how can progressives use storytelling to their advantage as a storyteller yourself?
I I think that we are slowly, as a storyteller in the South. I don't feel like I grew up with a lot of encouragement to hone the craft of storytelling.
Mm-hmm.
And as a person of color, like I think that we are just pushed to like do the safe thing. And writing is not the safe thing.
Right.
Videography is not that. It's like accounting, it's being a doctor. And storytelling like takes a lot of time and skill to perfect. And I'm grateful that I got to go to journalism school, but I just want to see more of that in Asian American communities and especially in the South, because I think that our communities in LA, New York City, like they're there, and we have a ton of amazing artists coming out of these cities. But in Atlanta, it's still very traditional, our Asian American community. And so like with collaboration coming here and like pushing Asian Americans in the arts, like that's incredible, because like art is resistance, it is advocacy, it is where like culture is created.
Right.
So if we can like kind of merge that art and civic engagement, like that's that good sweet spot for me.
Well, the last thing I wanted to get at before we go, we do this on every episode of the podcast because there's one thing that Southerners and Asian Americans share, and it's a deep love of food. As both an Asian American and as a Southerner, I wanted to ask you, is there a particular food that makes you think of that, chicken farm in South Georgia that you lived on, or even just like, what is the best food that like Atlanta or Georgia has to offer those of us who don't get to go down there? What is the one dish that brings you home every time?
Oh, that's hard. So many good dishes. I would have to say, I don't know if this is like generic, but like fried chicken. Fried chicken is like when I was growing up, my dad would fry our chicken with fish sauce. It's a very Vietnamese thing to do. Yeah. And then I remember like, and like every Asian American has like that story of like, like, your lunchbox moment when your friends are like, ew. But I had my fair share of those. But at the same time, like when I shared my dad's like fish sauce chicken wings with my friends, they were like, yo, this is the best thing we've ever had, And they're just like, man, I'm from the South. I know fried chicken, but this shit is delicious. And I'm like, I know. Like there's nothing like freaking like fish sauce fried chicken here. So I thought it was really cool that, like just from the fried chicken, we've been able to like make all these different dishes and like merge cultures.
Right.
And then when I tried like Korean fried chicken for the first time, I was like, oh shit, you guys win.
Oh, so I was going to ask you, like, I don't know, fish sauce fried chicken sounds pretty fucking good, but like, you give the title to Korean fried chicken?
So I think that there's no winning because it's like different moods.
Yeah, there you go.
And they just taste all so different. But I love that like every culture kind of has their own unique style. And then, you know, now there's like Southern Korean fried chicken. And I'm like, yeah, I'm here for this. Like,
Oh, nice.
I'm definitely here for this. And you get like some okras on the side. I'm like, what? This is amazing. So like like it's so interesting to me that like some schools, especially where I grew up, like found it like very important to have like cultural food like for school lunch. And so like I grew up eating like fried okras at school.
Right.
And like I loved going to school because it had the best food that my mom didn't make, you know, because she's like so Vietnamese. I was like, yo, I love this like Southern food.
That's awesome.
Yeah, fried chicken for sure.
Well, Kavi, thank you so much for spending some time to talk to me about everything that's happened. I mean, like you said, Georgia was the center of the world for the last few months, and let's hope it continues to be. We all keep our eyes on Georgia because, for example, Raphael Warnock is back up for election in 2 years, I believe.
Yes, sir. Yeah.
So we have to keep our foot on the gas and not let up and make sure that he goes back for a full Senate term in 2 years. And you know, maybe Stacey runs for governor again. Who knows?
Oh, I can't wait.
But we got to make sure Kemp and Roethlisberger are not there and continue keeping Georgia in the blue column. So Thanks for your hard work, Kavi, and thank you for being on the podcast.
Thank you. Thank you for amplifying our story and our voices. It's so important. Like, we're just so grateful for everybody kind of lending a hand and helping uplift Georgia.
To that point, how can people find you on the internet and your work, Kavi?
Oh, my work. So I was working with Asian American Advocacy Fund. So if anybody wants to kind of support Asian Americans in Georgia staying blue, then Asian American Advocacy Fund for sure. But personally, I am kavivu.com. It's KAVIVU.com. I'm a freelancer, so I kind of float. I don't like to stay at one place for long. So yeah, that's my personal.
Awesome. Well, again, thank you so much for joining us, and we'll definitely keep an eye out for all of the work that you'll be doing to make sure Georgia stays blue.
Oh, thank you so much.
Thanks once again to Kavi Vu for joining us on the podcast. Thank you for listening. You can find me, Keith Chow, on Twitter at @TheRealChow, _real_Chow. Follow the podcast at Southern Asians on Twitter and at Southern Fried Asians on Instagram. Go to hardknockmedia.com to find this and all of the podcasts in the Hard Knock Media Network. Subscribe and download Apple Podcasts, Google Play Music, Stitcher, Spotify, anywhere you get podcasts. Support us on patreon.com/thenerdscolor. Also find us on GoFundMe. As always, Southern Fried Asian is co-produced by Jess Vu. Email us thenerdscolor@gmail.com. Subscribe to our YouTube channel, youtube.com/thenerdscolor. And until next time, keep it Southern Fried, y'all.